Morning, everyone. Still have folks signing in, so we'll give just another minute or so. But to be respectful of your time, we won't wait too long on things. Scott, I see you have a hand up already. We do have the chat open and the Q&A open, should anybody have questions or need anything. But the format for today's session is a webinar.
So that's going to give me the job of monitoring the chat and the Q&A. If you have a question for Bob on things, we're going to take questions as we go along. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. I'll moderate those. And if you would, in the chat, we can use that function for just being chatty. So if you'll go ahead and put your name in there and your school and your role, that would be great. Always fun to know who's with us. And if you just want to make a comment during Bob's presentation, like, wow, that's cool, or I'm glad this finally happened, or that sucks, whatever it might be, you can put that type of thing in the chat. And questions that you have for me to pose to Bob, please feel free to put those in the Q&A part. Awesome. Seeing
And I
every
see folks are already doing this. If you would
Yeah.
take just a second and introduce yourself in the chat, we would appreciate it.
Welcome to my good friend Kathy Surd and to board member Patrick Weber. Great to have you with us. Good to see you, Ben Army and Steve Clark. Always good to have a superintendent friend on the line. Good to have you with us, Ben, also from Eaton Risa. Michelle, good to have another superintendent from Chippewa Hills with us. Robin, nice to see assistant principals with us. So awesome to have you as well. Casey Elmore, great to have you from Skyline High School. Boy, we are reporting in from all over the state today, Bob. Look how popular you are.
Look at me.
We have Lauren from the Jackson Area Career Center. Oh, we have another superintendent. Great to have you with us, Mark from Ovid Elsie. We've got Cohen from Homer High School and Jonathan Miller from Morenci Middle School High School. Big districts, small districts, people all over the state. Kim, good to have you, another curriculum instruction assessment person. Always welcome people from central office to participate as well. Everybody that's on here, please know we will be recording this webinar, and after the presentation's over, you will be receiving a link to that recording. So if somebody missed it that you want to share this with, please feel free to share the link. Once again, for those maybe who just tuned in, I'm Wendy Zadeb, MASSP's Executive Director, and this is Bob Kefgen, who's going to be facilitating this webinar. He is our esteemed lobbyist for MASSP, our full-time boots-on-the-ground person who gets things done at the Capitol for middle and high school principals. And we are going to be starting this webinar here in just a minute. And you can see everybody is doing introductions in the chat. Welcome, another board member, Brad Hale. Great to have you with us. And we'll be utilizing the Q&A function. If you have a question, I'm going to be monitoring that. Bob will take your questions as we go along. So, kind of as he hits different topics, feel free to pop that question in there, and I'll pose that to Bob as we go along. Once again, we will be recording this webinar, so if there's somebody that misses it, all of you who are attending will be getting the link. So we're going to go ahead and kick this off. We like to be prompt, so Bob, take it away.
For sure. Just a note on our disclaimer here. Please note that we are not lawyers. We are certainly not your lawyers. So when it comes to things like legal advice, please make sure you're checking with your own district legal counsel before making any decisions on exactly how to proceed with some of this. There are going to be some sticky pieces in budget boilerplate this year that I know the lawyers are already working through. But with that in mind, we will get going. I've titled today's session Bob's Budget Breakdown for a Broken Budget, because the budget process that we just went through was so painful, so god-awful painful. It felt like it took forever. It seemed like we were so hopeful that we might have a budget when I presented at EdCon this year, and then it just didn't happen until October. And so as we are dealing with the fallout from that, it's not just fallout in the local district level, but it is fallout at the state level, um, as the state is now dealing with, okay, well, it's partway through the year and we changed the rules on folks. What exactly are we going to do? How are we going to manage all of those things? And so I did just want to note here at the beginning a little bit about the state budget process and how this works, because this is not only impacting this year and what you guys are looking at, but also what's happening next year. So normally this is our state budget cycle, right? And we have a sort of offset cycle because the fiscal years for the schools, which are July to June fiscal years, are not the same as the fiscal year for the state. The state runs on an October to September fiscal year. But generally speaking, the state does get its budget done, or its budgets done, by mid-June to the end of June, so that budget implementation can be done by the state departments, by districts from July to September, going into that next school year. And then budget development for the subsequent fiscal year starts in the fall, starts traditionally right now. The executive office already starts looking ahead. The state departments start processing, what are we going to do for the next fiscal year's budget? And so right now what's happening is these two processes are happening simultaneously. The state is still implementing, and will be for several months, this most recently passed budget. At the same time, they're already planning ahead for the next budget. And so this is going to stretch out the timeline on both processes. Expect that next year's budget process will be a little bit rushed because there was less time to process coming out of this year's budget process. Expect that implementation for things like grant programs is going to take longer because the programs weren't passed into law until we were already into October. So an already slow process for budget implementation is going to get just a little bit slower. The other piece I want to draw to your attention is the idea of a book closing or error fixing budget supplemental. This is a traditional piece of the budget process. It's a big budget, right? One huge bill over 400 pages just for K-12. And so we finish these things up and we recognize after we've done them that there were some errors made. Shouldn't be, but there almost always are, or things that the state rolled out that they didn't think well enough about ahead of time, and then they realize after the fact, oops, nope, can't do that. And so there's a book closing supplemental to true up the spending numbers and fix errors that were made in the budget process. Well, this year's process being dropped at the last minute with almost no public oversight, there are going to be a whole bunch of errors. So I very much expect that there's going to be a budget supplemental sometime in December. The real question is what's going to be in that. Is it actually going to fix all the errors that we need fixed? Or is it just going to do a couple of things to make it okay for the state, but not really fix the issues for schools? We'll see. But be aware that that's coming and that some of these problem areas may shift as we get into the end of the calendar year, in time for the end of the school fiscal year, but it may not give you as much ramp up or lead time to fix it as you might like. So, as I always do with budget updates, I want to start with sort of the big ticket items. Foundation allowance and the big weighted foundation line items. So foundation allowance this year got a 4.6% increase. That's a good increase. It is better than inflation, which means that you're getting slightly ahead, right? As long as we keep ahead of inflation, or what's more appropriate for schools, the implicit government deflator. Don't ask what that is. It's just the thing that is inflation. That's the better measure of inflation for schools and other public institutions. As long as we stay ahead of that percentage, then we stay, schools are actually getting ahead. They're getting more money than they were the previous year. If we fall behind inflation, that's when we run into problems. The other thing I want to point out is that the two of the biggest weighted foundation line items, at risk and ELL, both got 25% increases this year. That's huge, because when they get increases bigger than the foundation allowance, those districts with populations of concentrated poverty or large ELL populations who need more services and therefore have higher costs, we close the gap between districts that have those higher need populations and districts that don't. And closing that gap, just like we did with 2X for years and years with the foundation, helps bring everybody up to a point of equitable funding. There are other added weights in the big picture items, things like special ed foundation, GSRP, CTE added cost, and early middle college programs. All of those programs got the same 4.6% increase as the foundation allowance. That's a good increase. Again, it's above inflation. It also makes sure that they keep pace with the foundation allowance. It doesn't necessarily close gaps, but especially for things like CTE or special ed, where we are closer to the target dollar amount that we should be shooting for, having those go up a pace with the foundation allowance is a good thing. So
So
those are the
Bob,
big picture. Go
can I
ahead.
can I just ask maybe kind of a clarifying point for those who might be kind of new to this budget process? There was a discussion and actually even some legislation introduced that would have eliminated categoricals. So could you just explain what categoricals are and like why that didn't happen and why that, when we look at these numbers, that's what kind of led me to think about that.
So funny you should ask about that. I wanted to make three big points about the large numbers, the sort of the big ticket items that always grab the headlines. One of those being weighted foundation, in other words, categoricals. So a categorical is a lobbyist term. It doesn't, you can type it into like a Word doc and Word will try to correct that word for you. No, it's a real word. It's just my word. Um, it's a lobbyist word that we use for anything in the budget that isn't the foundation, right? So the foundation is straight general fund for districts. It goes to you. You can use it however the heck you want. Very flexible. It doesn't necessarily mean that all of the mandates that get tied to school funding go away, but it's the most flexible piece of spending out there. Categoricals refer to programs that are other than the foundation where the state allocates money for a specific purpose. Now, the thing with categoricals is it used to be that most categoricals were grant programs or specialty programs, but over the years we've added what we call weighted foundation categoricals. These includes things like at risk, English language learners, special education, GSRP, that are particular line items dedicated to particular students with greater need. And I'll talk about that in a second. The other 2 points I'm going to highlight about these big picture items are the impact of inflation, which I've already hinted at a little bit, and the impact of pupil count. And so I want to take some time and break down these sort of big headline numbers that are the ones that get reported on, right? Because this is what you hear in the news, but we don't always process what that means. And so when I talk about weighted foundation in the context of categorical, so special line items set aside for students based on need, what we're looking at is the 2018 recommendations from a group called the School Finance Research Collaborative. School Finance Research Collaborative was a group of schools together with foundations and business that commissioned a study from a third party group called Augenblick and somebody or another to look at and price out the cost of the actual cost of educating Michigan students to the level of our state standards. In other words, if the standard is bringing everybody up to the state standards, and that's what we expect everybody to do, how much does that cost? And so they did several different methodologies. They talked to a host of educators from around the state, urban, suburban, and rural educators from districts of all different sizes and all different socioeconomic strata. And what they did is they broke down what those educators said. This is what I need. This is the staffing I need. These are the resources I need in order to educate students. Then they costed all that out and came up with a formula that would actually provide that. And so in 2018, they came up with this table, which basically said that they needed in 2018 a $9,590 foundation allowance with additional weights added to the foundation allowance, so an additional 35% of foundation allowance or a 0.35 weight for every student, every at-risk student, every student who is low socioeconomic status. Additional weights for English language learner students based on their WIDA level. In other words, based on how much English they're capable of fluently speaking, based on special education needs, whether or not they're a preschool student, because those students need greater staff ratios, whether or not the district is an isolated district. They also accounted for things like CTE, which has an added cost because you have additional resources needed there. And so, in other words, they came up and they said these weights account for students with greater needs, have greater costs to educate. And they made this overall recommendation. Now, the trick with all of this is that this was 2018, and they said we needed a 95/90. They came back and updated this study in 2021 and said, well, in 2021 dollars, using the same methodology, what we would need is a $10,421 foundation. And they said, going forward, use that government deflator index that I referenced earlier. So if we update that number from 2018 all the way to 2025, what this group said is that we need at a minimum a foundation allowance of $11,482. Well, we just had a really good budget cycle for keeping up. We stayed ahead of inflation. It's the largest foundation ever. Just read the headlines. Except we're still only 87.5% of what the recommended level should be. So as we're contextualizing this and we're reading about historic funding in education, balance that against where we should be, against where the experts have said this is what you need in terms of resources in order to truly educate students to the state standard. And yes, I agree with you, Steve, that it will always be a record level, right? Because every year when we allocate more, once we hit more money than last year, we're at a record level, even $1 more. But that's why it's important to contextualize it in terms of what are we aiming for? And as you pointed out, every year that $11,482 mark, that's this year's mark. Next year it goes up. And so are we progressing? It's sort of like students, right? Progress toward proficiency. Are we actually growing at a rate that we're ever going to get to the target foundation, or are we just keeping up with being less than and never making progress toward being enough? So we'll see. The other point here is that with poverty, the poverty weight and the English language learner weight, we should be at 0.35%. Current funding in at-risk puts us at 0.157%. I'm sorry, 0.157 or 15%. We're about halfway to where we should be on at-risk. We are a fraction of where we should be on ELL funding. And so there's a long, long way to go on funding for those line items before we're up to a point where we're actually providing what the School Finance Research Collaborative said we need. So good progress this year, but we still have a long way to go.
So as we talk about these categoricals, this is, kind of maybe a finer point of the budget, but, there'll be times where we'll hear, maybe support from the Superintendent's Association saying, we want to get rid of all the categoricals. And I'm thinking that they don't actually mean all. They mean kind of the pork categoricals, like the $1 million allocation for Algebra Nation, for example, but not these weighted pieces, which obviously would create a lot of winners and losers. And they're, in terms of the budget and how things are allocated. Another example that creates winners and losers that probably we wouldn't want to get rid of is something like transportation funding.
Right. And so where MASSP has shifted recently with the guidance from our members and our board, we did a priority setting process earlier this year and followed up with a big listening session at EdCon. And what came out of that on the back end, in part, is a focus on more formula grants or more formula-based line items and fewer competitive line items or specialty programs for specific vendors. In other words, do more of what we're doing here. Allocate funding to all districts based on a formula that makes sense, rather than parsing out $1 million for Algebra Nation or creating a competitive grant program that only folks with grant writers have access to. And to your point, Rob, yeah, they sink a lot of district time into writing grants for a program where you may not ever actually see grant money. And so we're focusing on what can we do to drive formula grants, and where there are going to be competitive grants, making them more accessible to folks and making them long-term so that it's not just year over year chasing dollars, but actually building into something that's going to produce results over a period of time. So I had 3 points with this. The first one was weighted foundation. The second one I want to draw attention to with this, I'm sorry. And with that weighted foundation, you can see we've been investing in at risk over time, right? So we've been building into this. And this graph doesn't even include the most recent year. But we've been pushing into at-risk appropriations, and we've been pushing into special ed appropriations, growing the dollars, even though the population may be staying about the same, or even in the case of special ed, shrinking a little bit, because we have never been at the place where we've adequately funded these line items. And so we will hope over the next several years we continue to see appropriations in these focused areas grow, because that's how we're going to close the gap and create an equitable foundation, not just an equal foundation. My second point I wanted to make is the point around inflation. And Steve already hinted at it, right? It's always a record level. That's how inflation works. If we look at the history of the foundation allowance over time, we just see it going up and up and up, and right. And we finally closed the gap using that 2x formula so that everybody now is at the same foundation. The exception of hold harmless districts or out of formula districts, everybody's at that $10,050 foundation allowance starting this year. The challenge with that is this graph, which we see, which always goes up and up, doesn't account for inflation. So when you adjust these numbers for inflation, you see a very different picture. And instead of drawing everybody up to the state max, you can very clearly see here we've done is really draw everybody down more toward a state minimum. Now, if you look at the last couple of years, last year, 23, 24, 25, you see a slight up tilt in that graph. There's been enough additional money put into K-12 education in the form of the foundation allowance and these weighted foundation categoricals that we're actually seeing growth in the line compared to inflation. Whether that continues over time, especially as the state continues to stretch and stretch school aid fund and not keep it just for investing in K-12 education, we'll see. The state seems to be unable to raise any new revenue to pay for things, and so they keep stretching their existing dollars further and further. But at least for the last couple of years, we've seen a slight uptick in how that goes. So positive, at least recent couple of years. The other big challenges, especially for districts with declining enrollment, primarily core urban districts and small rural districts, although there are plenty of suburban districts seeing declining enrollment, in a system where we allocate funding based on pupil count. When you have declining enrollment, you have declining money as well. And so over time, we've seen a between 5 to 10,000 pupil decline every year, year over year. And we saw that going into COVID, and then COVID hit and we dropped 40,000 pupils in a single year, just gone off the books, whether they're homeschooling or they moved out of state or they went to private schools, they are gone. And all indications are that rather than seeing a bump after COVID, the 40,000 kids are gone and not coming back. And we then have resumed our pace of 5 to 10,000 student per year loss. In other words, for a lot of districts, we're declining enrollment. They're getting less money year over year than they were before. And we've tried a number of things over the years to correct for this, right? We've tried different pupil count blends where we're looking backwards to see whether or not we have more pupils in the previous year, and try to smooth those things out. And you can see over time, we've tried just about every blend you could think of. But at the end of the day, we still are seeing a huge loss in pupils year over year. And so when you account for that in terms of what it is we're doing for pupil revenue, even though we've seen some uptick in the amount of total revenue per pupil over time, what we're really doing is just reallocating our savings from losing pupils back into the foundation allowance. In other words, we're raising the foundation allowance, but the dollars we're using to do that are the dollars that we're saving from having fewer kids. We're not putting more into the system. We're not growing the system overall. We're just reinvesting our savings year over year and keeping everything relatively flat or even declining. And so, especially for districts out there that are seeing significant pupil declines, and that's pretty much everywhere in the state except Southeast Michigan and the Grand Rapids area, you know the reality of seeing big numbers and big headlines, but looking at your local budget and actually seeing yourself in the red for the year. Travis, I see you put a question in the Q&A, trying to understand how there's not been more outrage regarding this particular cut. I didn't catch that question when it came in, so could you clarify which cut you're talking about? And Wendy, did you want to get on 147A4? Oh, so you're talking about the MIPSers hack. So yes, the MIPSers hack is significant, and I'm going to get to MIPSers. I was going to cover MIPSers
Yeah.
a little bit later today.
I told him you've
Um,
got that on slide 18, so we're coming to that one.
all right, cool. Well, I will talk about MIPSers when I get to slide 18. But yes, there should be outrage, great outrage. Sometimes it feels like we're shouting into the void, but let's at least shout, the void will listen. So I've talked about several different points this morning, not just about what the big numbers are, but what they might mean for a local district. So what I'd like you to do is, I've covered a lot of ground. Let's pause for just a second, process for yourself what you just heard around foundation allowance, the impact of pupil count, the impact of inflation, and how the state is allocating dollars based on pupil need more and more rather than just a flat per pupil. Coming out of that, what are some things that square with your understanding? Or what are some things that are circling your mind or some questions you might have? Or maybe jot down for yourself 3 points that you want to remember or think that are important that you don't want to forget coming out of this section. And if you have a question coming out of that processing, please feel free to put that in the Q&A, and we'll answer those before we move on.
If you want to pop a square, circle, or triangle in the chat just to share your thinking, that's great as well. So it's just a little bit of time for you to process and jot down some notes, or pop a question into the Q&A as you're working.
Steve, I certainly can. If you look in the chat, you'll see a link that I just shared to the School Finance Research Collaborative website. I linked you directly to where you can find the studies. They've done 3 so far that are linked on their website. I thought there was a fourth on facilities, but they've looked at the original study costing out what it costs to educate a pupil in Michigan. Then they updated that in 2021. They did a study on transportation costs. And most recently, they've done a study on facilities costs, really digging down into what it's going to cost to educate students in Michigan. And all of those reports are up on their website. All right.
Yes, Josh was talking about looking at the per pupil increase, when you're also talking about declining enrollment, and declining enrollment is almost like a separate topic when it comes to budget.
It is, but I think Josh really hits the heart of it there, which is that rather than investing new dollars, right, we're just reallocating existing resources. It's not quite shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic, but to really get to that place where we're actually allocating the dollars that we need, that the School Finance Research Collaborative says we need toward public education, it's going to take some investment. Mark, I will look that up on the funding formula as it applies to declining enrollment districts. There is an offset in the budget right now, specifically targeted at 75 million a year at declining enrollment districts, and I'll hit on that in a second. But then the other piece of this is the pupil count mix, how we mix pupil count. Right now, it's your pupil count for your district is 90% based on current year fall count, the count you guys just did, and 10% based on prior year spring count. So there's always a um, there's always a slowing of pupil decline based on that prior year spring count. Wendy, you want to see if you can share? Oh, did I just share to the, hold on. There we go.
You did, but I shared it to everyone.
There we got it.
All right, I don't see any more reflecting, so we can charge on.
Excellent. So some other highlights from the budget. And with this next section, I'm going to run through parts of the budget that aren't the big picture line items and some context and specifics that you absolutely need to know as you're going to implement this budget. I talked about School Finance Research Collaborative looking at transportation costs. Well, in response to that, the state has put a line item in the budget to offset transportation costs for districts that either have long runs or particularly large geographic area. This isn't limited to small and rural districts. It can be a district that just has very high transportation costs because they're doing a lot of runs. But it's $125 million and it's been there for 2 or 3 years now to pay for transportation funding. There is a fund set aside in the budget, the Transportation Cost Reserve Fund, that's been put in the budget that is that gets refreshed by the state, and they refreshed it again this year, that helps pay for this line item. So while the funding is one time year over year, the reason that it's one time in part is because rather than pulling it out of and making it an ongoing funding line item, they're drawing down year over year from a pre-existing fund. And the reason they created these funds is because coming out of COVID, there was a lot of one-time money in the school aid budget. We had a huge boost in sales tax in the short term over COVID, and more money than we could reasonably spend in a year without creating a cliff at the end. And so the state took a bunch of those dollars and pushed them into funds, reserve funds, that they've been spending down out of over time. One of those is for transportation funding. Another one is the declining enrollment offset that I talked about earlier, which is a $71 million fund to help offset the cost of declining enrollment for districts year over year. And Mark, your question still stands. I got to go find the formula for that, which I'll do at our next processing slide. But there are specific funds in the budget to offset declining enrollment for districts with declining enrollment, and those dollars come out of a reserve fund. Now, what happens when we get to the end of the reserve fund and there's no more money in the fund, but we still have districts that have high transportation costs or declining enrollment? That's a real question. The other challenge here is that these line items aren't growing, right? 125 million for transportation, but it's not growing year over year with inflation. So is it going to eventually fall behind the way at-risk did for years and years? It's possible. It's not the same as an ongoing line item that we update year over year, but it's the first time the state has ever recognized the cost of transportation funding in the budget specifically, the same with the cost of declining enrollment in the budget specifically, right? So there are at least good recognitions and a move towards something sustainable long term. Another highlight from the budget is a $70 million grant program called Pathways to Success, aimed at creating CTE programs in current CTE deserts, areas of the state where there isn't a center-based program or even a district-based CTE program out there, to really build in CTE infrastructure in parts of the state where there isn't any currently. Now, the problem with a competitive grant program targeted at areas of the state that probably don't have a whole lot of grant writers, the irony is not lost on me, but it is an amount of money dedicated toward that end. So at least it's a recognition by the state that there are needs that aren't being met in students who are trying to access CTE services that can't. Speaking of CTE, the money for CTE incentives was continued. That's $88 per pupil. Now those dollars go to the local district sending kids to CTE, not to the CTE program itself. But if you're a district-based CTE program, you get to keep those dollars. And the idea of it was not necessarily to offset CTE costs, but to incent districts to send students to CTE programs to the extent that they can. There are infrastructure grants in the budget. Again, competitive grants. We don't love these, but dollars in there for infrastructure projects. continuing this idea of recognizing that schools have infrastructure needs that aren't accounted for in the current formula and can't always be covered by local tax dollars because of the variability of local tax base. We've continued literacy supports year over year for folks that also deal with the lower grades. And dropout recovery supports, which have been in the budget for a number of years now, have been carried forward at $1.5 million. We got a question earlier about MIPSers. We are currently spending $2.2 billion a year off the top of the school aid fund, mitigating MIPSers costs that would otherwise flow to districts. On the positive side of this, 27L allocates $153 million in MIPSers cost offsets in addition to the rate reduction the district saw last year to offset the cost of the employees' 3% healthcare contributions. So the way this worked last year is we eliminated district contributions toward retiree healthcare. We eliminated the employees' 3% toward retiree healthcare, but said that districts, you have to pick up the 3% if there's ever debt in the system. Well, because the system calculation lags behind what the actual funds in the in MIPSers are, while the fund itself is 150% overfunded, the state calculates it with a 5-year look back. And so for this year, at least, they're saying that districts would have to make up $153 million of the employee 3%. We expect that to diminish or maybe even go away next year, the year after. But for now, the state is continuing to put in that $153 million to offset district MIPSers costs. So positive there. On the bad side, to Travis's question from earlier, they eliminated $100 million in 147A that's been there for probably the better part of a decade now, which buys down about 1% of the MIPSers rate that districts pay above and beyond any other rate reductions. It's been there so long, I think the state for the most part forgot that it was there. But with the recent changes in MIPSers, it was like, oh, look, $100 million. And they eliminated that $100 million offset. Yes, that is a big cost to districts. Yes, it's coming out of what you would have paid otherwise. The question about, why isn't there more outrage related to that? I think the answer to that is because overall, districts, when you account for the employee 3%, are still probably $53 million to the good, rather than $100 million to the bad. Now, this is a state retirement system, not a district retirement system. Districts have no say over the investments in the system, and districts didn't create the debt in the system. The state did. So yes, I would agree with the point that it's the state's responsibility to pay this off, and we should absolutely be doing that off the top of school aid fund, or better yet, out of the state's general fund, since it isn't really a school cost and it is a state system. That said, overall, between the foundation increase, which is greater than inflation, significant increases to at-risk and ELL, and $153 million in MIPSers to offset employee retirement costs, it's tough to pull out this particular point and be outraged over this particular point when there are so many counterbalancing points in the budget as a whole. So yeah, it's not good. And yes, we're making a point of saying it, and I clearly called it out in the slides. But it is somewhat counterbalanced. And yes, Travis, I get it that depending on your district and depending on your district payroll, if you're a high payroll district, you could absolutely see this cause you to have a somewhat flat budget this year, or even a lost budget, especially when you consider pupil count into that as well. The state's also continuing investment into educator recruitment and retention. We've reworked the language around educator mentoring this year. So hopefully that'll actually get these funds kicked loose to pay for the required mentoring for teachers and school administrators. The state created a new $70 million Grow Your Own program line item. We've been toying around with this a couple of different ways over the years. Sometimes it's a large Grow Your Own grant program that's a little bit more flexible. Sometimes it's dedicated to specific programs like the Talent Together initiative. Whatever it is, the state's continuing to invest dollars in Grow Your Own programs. We also have we've continued the student teacher stipend, the My Future Educator Fellowship, And the result of some of these programs taken together is that Michigan is seeing some of the best increases in teacher prep enrollment in the country. I think we are the best increase in teacher prep enrollment in the country year over year. We are back to, I think it was 2013 levels of total enrollment the last time I looked. Now, we don't have quite the number of completers we had back then, but that tends to be a lagging indicator. So at least enrollment on the front end is positive, and seeing a trajectory on that going up where the rest of the nation is going down. So some positive signs there about Michigan teacher preparation programs. The other thing that was added to the budget around the idea of recruitment and retention was employees are seeing massive increases in their healthcare costs this year. Healthcare costs went up at the same time that the district cap, the hard cap on how much districts can pay toward healthcare costs, was largely stagnant. So employees picked up a huge share of their employee healthcare costs this year. This is cash for educators. It's an attempt by the unions basically to offset the increase in healthcare costs for employees. It is not tied to that. It'll be allocated to districts on a per pupil basis. So the amount of money you get will vary, but $203 million divided by pupils allocated on a per pupil basis. And then how those dollars are allocated within a district is subject to collective bargaining. So not just collective bargaining with your teachers' unions, but your bargaining units as a whole, including your administrator unit if you have school administrators. The money is for educators writ large, not specifically for teachers or any specific position. So do make sure that as you're working on this, you're ensuring that if you're a superintendent, all of your employees get a share of this. If you're a principal, that you're advocating to make sure that you, as an educator in your district, are included in the educator compensation dollars that your district gets. We've continued since COVID especially, but even before then, to put dollars into student supports, things like school mental health and safety money, universal free meals, before and after school programs, school-based health centers, vision, hearing, and dental screenings. The state continues to invest in these school-based student supports that aren't specifically academic, but address more of the Maslow's needs rather than the Bloom's hierarchy. There is a note on that mental health and safety money about investigation language that I will cover in the next slide. But overall, the point here is that the state is continuing to invest significant amounts of money year over year into these student supports, like mental health and safety and universal free meals. Sorry, I noticed a question come up that I hadn't answered earlier. I will get to your question, Steve. For those of you who deal with not just secondary schools, but also elementary or even pre-K programs, I've taken everything and distilled that I can possibly know about GSRP and elementary funding and put it on one slide just here for your review. We will, of course, share all the slides and the recording with folks afterwards. But this is everything I know, really, literally everything I know. I'm a secondary schools guy. But I can tell you that, for example, you can use your at-risk money to reduce K-3 class size. There's a $65 million grant available this year for K-3 class size reductions. That was a big talking point with the Senate and the governor, especially going into this year's budget, about the importance of reducing K-3 class size. GSRP programs have been expanded, household income limits stripped, and we've continued an investment in things like GSRP startup grants, a 3-year-old GSRP pilot, early literacy coaches, letters training. So there are significant resources flowing to those GSRP and elementary level programs to continue investment in the younger grades. But the fine print that we need to know with some of the things that happened in this year's budget, those boilerplate details that are important for implementation. I mentioned one of these already, which is that the mental health and safety money has been made contingent on a district being willing to allow a state-directed investigation in the event of should there be a mass casualty event. Now, the problems with this mass casualty event, as it's defined, doesn't just mean school shooting. It means anything where you have multiple people injured or any one person killed or dead at a school. So it's a big, broad, wide open definition for what is mass casualty event. And the degree of waivers that the state's requiring on this impacts, per one legal opinion I read, down to things like attorney-client privilege. So it's a big question mark whether or not it's safe for districts to accept these dollars given the waiver that the statute requires. Uh, all of the major school law firms are thinking about this and opining on what it might mean, whether it's even constitutional. I know there was that the big insurance companies, including Setseg, are taking a look at this to see what it might do to insurance rates should a district sign a waiver like this. In other words, don't go out and accept that school mental health and safety money is done and that it's coming into your budget in the form that it has in the past. They tied some big old strings to this that may make it so that you don't want to accept these dollars. Now, given the timeline on this, we've got at least a month or two before there's going to be a need to decide one way or the other. So we'll have some time for your law firm to weigh in, but definitely check with your school attorneys on this and check with your insurance company to make sure that you aren't signing a waiver that's going to sign away important rights that you have as a district or impact your governmental immunity, which is the other big consideration here. Second point, if you are a district that has been planning or has been using the virtual learning flexibility for things like state testing days, in other words, you bring in your tested students, have everybody else stay at home, but you get to count it as an instructional day because you assign non-tested students a virtual lesson. Unfortunately, that flexibility got stripped in this year's budget. We thought, based on the drafts going into conference, that it was going to go from 15 days down to 7. And while that wasn't great, it wasn't the end of the world. What we ended up with in conference committee is they kicked out a budget that eliminated those days entirely. So we could, as I mentioned earlier, come back and deal with this in a supplemental in time for spring testing. But at least for now, you need a contingency plan in place for what you're going to do for your spring testing days should you not be able to use virtual learning. And you need to start thinking about that now, because if you need to add days to your calendar, you want as much time as you can get to do that processing. Opportunity bands 4 to 6. On the good side of this, folks in opportunity bands 4 to 6, so about half of the state with the highest concentrations of poverty, can use your at-risk dollars for teacher recruitment and retention efforts. That's a pretty flexible allowance for those at-risk funds. So a good thing to have, much more like pushing at-risk into the idea of a weighted foundation where you can spend it how you want rather than tying it to specific programs. And anybody who has a significant English language learner population, understand that that funding that you get for that can now also be used for software, not just for hiring staff.
And
So some important fine print in the budget this year.
this has been a great, piece with the advent of AI in terms of the availability of so many programs that really provide great translation pieces that would be, revolutionary for a lot of English language learners. So it's great that this money can be used for software as well. Bob, we did have a question in the chat. Was there any discussion around greater flexibility for spending 31A/41 funds for EL staffing needs to offset costs in order to meet the EL staffing calculator recommendation?
So there's been discussion on it, but there hasn't been any resolution on exactly what that looks like. What I would suggest in the short term is that you utilize the flexibilities that have been added as much as you can to get around that, right? So things like if you can use at-risk dollars for teacher recruitment and retention, maybe you can justify that as a way of offsetting current spending that you do to create more flexibility in your general fund so that you can push dollars into those EL staffing calculator recommendations. There is, like we saw on this slide, they've added flexibility in the ELL funding to use for software. So yes, there's some talk about flexibility, and we're trying as best we can to push more flexibility into those big categorical programs, right? ELL, at-risk, special ed, so the districts truly have a weighted foundation, right? Flexible money that they get to direct rather than these specific tied down categorical programs. But we haven't quite gotten there yet. Steve, I still see your question. I will get to it. at the end. The other thing I want to talk about before I leave the subject of boilerplate and details in this budget is new language in section 164K. Yes, we go all the way up to 164K. There are that many sections in the school aid budget. This one added a new 5% penalty in boilerplate tied to any of the following 5 items on this list. And I want to spend a little bit of time on the first 2 of these specifically. First of these, they said if a district must require all households in the district to complete the free and reduced lunch application to the extent practicable. Now, that language on extent practicable matters because per MDE, federal regulations prohibit a requirement for families to complete the federal application. In other words, the state's saying you have to require families to complete this application to the extent practicable. The feds are saying you cannot require families to complete this application. And so how do you balance this nonsense, right? Where the state's saying you have to do this as best you can, and the feds are saying you may not do this. The answer is that you do what you've pretty much largely been doing already. You make sure the form is sent home to families and you let them know that it's there. You urge as many families as possible to fill out the free and reduced lunch application. You make sure you're communicating that even if you're not going to get free and reduced lunch, it's important to fill out the form so that the school gets accurate allocations of things like at-risk funding or other funding that's based on socioeconomic status. And you encourage, but you stop short of requiring families to fill it out. If anybody needs it, somewhere deep in my email, I have a actual citation to where MDE says the feds prohibit you from requiring families to complete that. But the bottom line is the balance on this is encourage, send home, chase it to the extent that's reasonable, but realize that you can't simply require people to fill it out. The second piece of this that's maybe going to require a little bit more finesse, especially for secondary school principals, is a requirement for districts to share all student survey questions and results, make those publicly available, post them on your website, and notify parents about the surveys ahead of time. This is something that the House added specifically. As they kept talking about, we want to give districts more flexibility. They also added this nonsense language that is completely unmanageable. So, for example, how do you share all of students' survey results and not violate HIPAA and FERPA? The answer is that you're probably going to end up sharing aggregate results. We're not sure yet. We specifically asked the Department of Education for some guidance on what this looks like for districts, because you can take student surveys and post them on your website and let parents know that kids are going to take these surveys. You can share all the questions, but at the end of the day, you can't share results for individual student survey results. That's a significant HIPAA and FERPA violation. Nor can you share aggregated results for small subgroups. So if you have a particularly small student population or you have a subgroup of students where the group is small enough that you could be sharing individualized results with people, that's not something you can do. So how do we square that circle? We don't know yet. We're asking for some guidance on that. I think the answer is going to be, I know at least from the department, part of their answer is going to be, we're not coming out and checking for this. The only way we're coming after anybody is if somebody reports it. So be proactive on this, put stuff on your website about surveys, but on the results side of things, there's only so much you can do.
You know, Bob, I was thinking about this and like, how stupid is this going to get? Because, a high school might send out a survey to the kids saying, do you want to continue with homecoming court as we have it? Would you prefer to go to this or that? There's tons of surveys that people do. I think obviously what they're getting at here is more of like the surveys that go out about kind of climate and culture type things and school safety type things. But if we're taking it to the letter of surveys, mean, their teachers, individually do surveys, in their classrooms. Would you prefer to have, a group assignment, or would you prefer to have a, independent assignment, that type of stuff? So, right. I mean, I was definitely thinking of that MyFi survey as that's what they want to see.
Right.
But, districts have developed some of their own, or maybe they work with a company. We also have over in Kent County, they have developed a pretty extensive student survey that I know a lot of districts in the state are using. So I think that's what they're really getting at. And then, like you said, Bob, that aggregate, data kind of in pie charts maybe is something that could be put together. But if we're talking about surveys, it could get pretty granular.
Right. And that's part of the discussion we're going to be having with the legislature if they get into a supplemental is, guys, you said every survey, like homecoming court, you really want homecoming court? You want the results about what kids think about the meat, school meal food.
The
Do you
themes,
really want
here
teachers
are
asking
five
about how they
themes
prefer to
for
do homework?
Yeah, here are five themes for prom this year. What one do you want? I mean, like all that, type of
I mean,
stuff.
we would spend all day doing nothing but posting surveys. So realistically, what does this look like?
Exactly. Yeah.
So again, we've processed a lot of details here, right? About everything from the specifics of like sharing MyFi survey results or survey results generally, to some of those details about MIPSers and the specific line items. Before I get to the processing, Steve, I did want to directly answer your question. Uh, you asked if there was a reversal of the MIPSers offset used last year as a replacement for per pupil funding. The answer is no, there was not a reversal on this. That was a House proposal. That was in the House budget that they wanted to flip the unfunded liability rate back up to 20.96%. That did not pass. So that reduced unfunded liability rate, what's called the UAAL, unfunded accrued actuarial liability, is still 5% lower than it was. It's in the 15% range now as opposed to the 20% range. So that was not part of it, but that certainly was something that the House put on the table at one point. So again, to the earlier question about, why aren't more people outraged about the $100 million in 147A? Because there was an old saying from John Engler, show them death and they'll accept dismemberment. That's somewhat of what you see this year, right? We saw a really, really bad budget out of the House. And that was pretty scary. And so when it came in much, much better than that, the relative willingness of folks to accept some of these things and the floor on what folks were willing to take for a positive budget was changed.
Bob,
So,
one thing that's been interesting, you're identifying how strings have been attached, to certain, funding mechanisms. One that we did dodge a bullet on was early on, we had heard that there was talk about bringing back A through F and that being attached to funding.
yep. So actually, I'm going to continue. I'm not going to pause for processing here because I'm looking at the time and realizing where we are. And I wanted to just hit a couple more things before we ended today. The first of these is I want to point out that the school aid fund continues to be rated to balance the state's general fund budget. We don't know exactly how much in program transfers is in there. The House fiscal and Senate fiscal agencies haven't processed that yet. But even if we just look at higher ed and community college diversion this year, we are at a record high diversion of school aid dollars to offset general fund budget costs, an additional $400 million this year, pushing us close to or even over $1.5 billion in school aid funds that is not going to K-12 education in any way, shape, or form. So as we continue to hear about historic funding in the headlines, realize that what we're really talking about, at least in part on the back end, is a historic raid of K-12 education funding to offset the general fund budget. And when we do look at that overall K-12 appropriations adjusted for inflation, what we see is that rather than being a historic high, we're actually we're above the historic lows that we saw for about 10 years from 2010 to 2020, but we're nowhere near the historic funding levels that everybody talks about. And when we compare ourselves to other states, in terms of where's Michigan funding going compared to where are other states investing in education. What you're seeing is that every other state in the nation is increasing its investment in education or maintaining its investment in education, where Michigan is losing investment in education. Um, and so that's really, as we continue to hear about things like, well, how is Michigan doing on NAEP scores? Well, what are you spending on education in the state of Michigan compared to what they're spending in the states you're comparing us to? And if you're not maintaining that effort and continuing to grow education funding year over year when you adjust for inflation, you are getting out of the system what you are putting into it. And that's sad, but that's also a reality that so often gets overlooked when people get distracted by the large ticket or the large dollar amounts that show up in the budget. Yeah, it's a big number. It's not as big as it needs to be. So, very briefly at the end, I do want to talk a little bit about the federal budget and what impact that's having on everything. The big beautiful bill passed, and while that didn't directly impact education, part of what it did impact is SNAP benefits in the state of Michigan and Medicaid benefits, with the result that in the coming years, we're going to see significant cuts to SNAP benefits and Medicaid benefits in the state, and people pulled off of those benefits or families disqualified. On the education side of this, that's not just going to impact the families in our communities, it's also going to boost the cost of school services. I talked about student supports earlier, things like universal meals. Um, as we're looking at these things, there's going to be potentially more demand for school services in terms of school-based health services, school meals, as more and more families lose community-based benefits. On the flip side of this, we use programs like TANF and SNAP eligibility to qualify kids for school meals. And so the importance of filling out those federal forms is going to grow over time as more families are taken off of the SNAP and Medicaid rolls and aren't automatically enrolled in those programs. So kind of both a push and a pull on schools with regard to what this bill that already passed is going to do with federal costs. Thank you, Wendy, for putting that in the chat. SNAP, by the way, is food assistance, Medicaid being healthcare assistance. After withholding dollars for many, many months, the Fed finally did release the state's Title II, Title IV-A and B money. But while all of these funds got released for the current year budget, albeit late, we're looking ahead at a budget. We've got a government shutdown right now and a debate over education funding. And what's on the table are massive cuts to those same programs. Elimination of Title I-C, Title III. There's been some talk about hacking Title II, teacher and school leader incentive grants. All of these programs have been in the budget and around the budget on the federal level for years and years and years. And so we're seeing a significant upheaval in what education funding might look like from the feds going forward. Now, the feds budget prospectively, whereas the state budget's year over year, the feds budget 2 years out. So what they're arguing about for schools, at least, is not this year's education budget, but the 26-27 education budget. But still, we could be seeing some massive impacts to some of these programs that fall maybe a little bit down the line. They're not Title I or necessarily or IDEA, but Title I-C, Title II, Title III, programs that districts rely on for things like professional development or ELL students that could get hacked or rolled up into a block grant and then hacked so that schools are seeing fewer resources overall. We'll have to see as the budget process plays out, but right now it doesn't look like the process is playing anything except shutdown, which is pretty ugly. But to contextualize this, do understand that the impact of federal cuts in Michigan, while not nothing, are not everything. There are many states out there that rely very heavily on federal funding for their education budget. Michigan is not one of those states. Only about 11% overall of our school budget comes from the feds. Not everything. And when we're talking about that budget, almost half of those funds go to school meals. So if we back school meals out of this, the direct funding we get for academic programs in the forms of Title I, special ed, Title II, are a little over $1 billion, just shy of $1.5 billion. So closer to maybe 6 or 7% of our total state budget rather than the huge chunk. So not nothing, but not an insurmountable challenge should some of those programs get hacked, provided the state makes up the difference in the same way so that schools aren't losing out year over year. So I would encourage you, even though I know I'm 5 minutes over time, take a minute for yourself. Before you sign off, jot down a couple of notes. What are some things you found important? What are some key ideas you want to make sure you take back to your staff or take back to leadership in your district? Or what might a summary be that you'd share with a colleague about today's presentation? And Wendy and I will stick around for several minutes. If you guys have any other questions or comments, please feel free to put those in the chat, and we will stick around as long as we have folks and answer questions on the back end of this. And of course, if you have any questions after the fact, please feel free to send those to me or to Wendy. But my contact information is up on the screen, and you are welcome to ask me questions directly.
We will be sharing the presentation, so everybody that registered for this webinar will be receiving a recording. Are we also sharing the slides, Bob, or just the recording?
Yep. Slides will be out there too.
Okay, so we'll be including both of those. As you saw, I also referenced an upcoming webinar that we have, which is a great 101 of school aid. You know, all those questions you get from parents or friends or whatever that say, why are the schools always having a hard time with money? Don't you get all that money from the lottery, etc.? We have a webinar with Jen Smith, who's the lobbyist for the Michigan Association of School Boards, coming up. What's the date for that, Bob? I didn't indicate that.
October 30th.
Okay, it's October 30th, and that's going to be a great, kind of school aid 101. But Jen really talks about why our budget is getting hit from a lot of different angles. And even though I've been doing this for 15 years and I feel like I'm pretty knowledgeable of school aid, I learned a lot from Jen's presentation. So I would definitely encourage you to consider it. The other thing, I did put in a link at the end for an upcoming event that MASSP has. We have a Catalyst conference coming up, which is focused on artificial intelligence. And we're really encouraging people to bring a school team to that event. So it's an opportunity to include kids in the conversation. We would suggest principal, maybe assistant principal, some teacher leaders and some students to really be talking about, the teaching and learning of AI and what school's going to look like moving forward. But it's really a plug to bring students into this conversation. We always welcome people from central office. So if we have superintendents or assistant superintendents or curriculum directors interested, please join us for that event as well. So I think we're going to wrap things up for today. Great job on this, Bob. We'll be getting that recording out shortly.